Good morning. Welcome all of you here with us today. My name is David Luke. I'm the Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Michigan-Flint. And in my role, I'm fortunate to be a part of the MLK Day Planning Committee, along with co-chair Gary Ashley and committee members Chris DeUlis, Laquana Dockery, Araya L., Stephen Landis, Mia McNeil, Justin Newman, and Todd Womack. I want to give a brief outline of the program. First, I will welcome Chancellor Dutta, followed by a brief institutional welcome from Chris Pearson, Dean of the College of Innovation and Technology. Next will be an invocation from Pastor Sherman McCathern, remarks from our Student Government President, Levi Todd, followed by our Lieutenant Governor, Garland Gilchrist. And then the keynote conversation with Dr. Cy Stokes, which will be introduced and moderated by Gerard Wheeler, the Race, Ethnicity, Intercultural, and Intersectional Identities Program Manager from the University of Michigan-Dearborn Center for Social Justice and Inclusion. So with that, I'd like to welcome Chancellor Dutta.
So good morning, everyone, and thank you, David, for giving me the opportunity. I know we have attendees from UM-Dearborn, we have the Lieutenant Governor, and many other dignitaries. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending. It's a very important day, an annual day of reflection, of prayer, of service. And on this day, we not only remember and honor Dr. King, we also honor all those who came before him and all those who come after him, who are working on the same cause that he so eloquently highlighted for the nation. It is customary at this event at UM-Flint for the Chancellor to give the welcome, the official welcome. But as I was thinking about it, it occurs to me that progress comes because you have a good team. It's a result of a teamwork. And I'm proud to say that at UM-Flint, we do have a solid team, all committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm going to start a different way for this morning. And instead of me giving the official welcome, I'm going to share the platform. I'm going to highlight another leader who is just as committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that person this morning is Dean Chris Pearson. It is my pleasure to introduce him to all of you. He's a longtime faculty member at UM-Flint and an administrator, and now the inaugural dean of the College of Innovation and Technology. So with that brief introduction, let me give the floor to Dean Pearson.
Thank you, Chancellor Dutta. Good morning. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome you again to everyone today. As Chancellor Dutta mentioned, I am presently serving as the Dean of the College of Innovation and Technology, and I was very excited to receive the invitation for today. For those of you who are not as familiar with CIT as I am, it was established by the University of Michigan Board of Regents in September of 2020, and the first students were in class in August of 2021, only 11 months later. I am of an age that I can remember when today's holiday was established. I was in college when the first nationwide observance was held. A few years later, its designation as a National Day of Service was established. Over the years, this day has led hundreds of thousands of people to participate in service to strengthen communities and tackle social challenges. Sometimes projects started on the MLK Day of Service extend beyond the holiday, but clearly the past several years have shown that there remains a long road ahead. As Dean of CIT, I am keenly interested in attracting talent. It's possible that a person's experiences may hide or obscure their talent. Perhaps they were never provided a platform to showcase their talents. Here we must redouble our efforts to remove barriers and create pathways for success. Because the alternative leaves a lot of talent on the sideline, and today's problems are much too challenging to solve without a full team. Again, welcome to today, and please consider what you can do for your day on of service.
Thank you, Chancellor Dutta and Dean Pearson. With that, I'd like to invite Pastor Sherman McCathern for an invocation.
Our prayer taken from the Ministry Matters, Let Us Pray. It is given to only a few people of God to rise above the crowds and become symbols of hope and passion to us all. We thank you for such persons, for Moses and Christ, for Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King, and for the way they remind us of your care and grace for all the little ones of the earth. We praise you today on this day for the qualities that shape their lives, for a strong sense of justice that regarded all souls as having importance in your eyes, for an unshakable belief in love and gentleness that would not permit him to turn to violence in order to achieve his dreams, but a commitment to sacrifice that led him forward without regard for his own safety, and for an ultimate trust in you that would never abandon those who stand up for truth and righteousness in this world. We celebrate the dream for which he stood of a society where the lion and the lamb would lie down together, and the children of all races and backgrounds would mingle together in sweetness and harmony of spirit. Help us to be as committed to that dream as he was, to care as much about the poor and the disenfranchised as he did, and to be prepared to pay the price that he paid to ensure its ultimate success. Teach us to love all men and women, our brothers as brothers and sisters, and to care as much for their welfare as we care of our own. We grant that we shall always have heroes whom we admire for their moral clarity, their unremitting courage, and their passion for righteousness, that your name and your way may be honored in all the world. Through Christ, our Savior, we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor McCathern. Next, I am happy to introduce our Student Government President, Levi Todd, who will provide some brief remarks and welcome our own Lieutenant Governor and Michigan Wolverine, Garland Gilchrist. Levi?
Good morning, and blessings on each and every one of you. My name is Levi Todd, and I have the pleasure of serving as the student body president here at the University of Michigan-Flint. I want to thank Dr. Luke and Gary Ashley and the MLK Day Planning Committee for having me today and putting on this amazing program. Today, we are here to honor the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. When I think of Dr. King, I think of a man who touched the lives of millions across the nation and the world. Dr. King envisioned a world where his children would not be judged by the color of their skins, but the content of their character. His vision of equality and civil disobedience changed the world for his children and the children of all oppressed. Today, we face many challenges, but Dr. King's dream is still alive and well, and I see its promises every day in my life and those around me. Segregation in America has been abolished in an official manner. Although we see discrimination in other ways, certain inner cities, like the city of Flint and Detroit, continue to struggle with violence and a need for equal pay and equal opportunity. If Dr. King was alive today, he would be rallying in every city that faced inequity and injustice. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Michigan. Lieutenant Governor Garland Gilchrist has a dedicated career to solving problems and engineer by training. He uses thoughtful innovation and progressive reform and efficient modernization of policies and programs to make the work better for hardworking families, from spearheading campaigns for equality and justice to harnessing technology to solve real problems. His focus has consistently remained on serving the public and getting things done. He brings a lifetime of experience to the task, receiving his first computer at the age of 5 and setting up a computer lab in Detroit, in Detroit Community Recreational Center using computers that he built himself at age 16. Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist studied computer engineering and computer science at the University of Michigan, graduating with honors, and later had a successful career as a software engineer at Microsoft, helping to build SharePoint into the fastest growing product in the company's history. Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist spent the next several years of his career as a social entrepreneur and community organizer who helped people in communities across America realize their full economic and political potential. Upon returning home to Detroit, Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist worked in local government to build systems that made the government more responsive, transparent, and accountable to city residents. This experience prepared him for a key priority to bring Michigan state government fully into the 21st century on every level. As a part of the Whitmer administration, Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist has sought to address injustice and inequity at our state and every level, from co-chairing the Michigan Joint Task Force on Jail and Pretrial Incarceration to hemming the Coronavirus Task Force on Racial Disparities. These task forces have taken action and saved lives and protected our most valuable populations. Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist's approach to addressing these disparities is deeply rooted in fact-based practices, sciences, and connecting with individuals across Michigan. Lieutenant Governor Garland Gilchrist and his wife Ellen reside in Detroit, where they are raising their twins Emily and Garland III and daughter Ruby. Without further ado, U of M-Flint, will you help me recognize the Lieutenant Governor of the great state of Michigan, Garland Gilchrist II?
Thank you, Levi, for the amazing introduction. It is always good to see you, my friend. I also want to thank you, Chancellor Dutta, Dean Pearson, Dr. Luke, all of the folks who helped to make this program possible today. Y'all are going to be in for a real treat for the keynote from Dr. Stokes. This is just a really proud day to be here with you on this King Day. So go blue as always. As Levi said, I am a Wolverine through and through, and it's such an honor to connect with the U of M-Flint family here this morning. Today marks the 36th MLK Day. As the speakers before me have noted, this is a opportunity for reflection and understanding. It's also a day of service and a day of action. You know, when we think of Dr. King, we think about the black and white, grainy TV images of the I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington in August of 1963. And that day truly was, you know, one of the most epic moments, one of the sort of heights, the highest highs of Dr. King's rhetorical prowess beyond the world stage. But I want to actually wind the clock back a little bit before that, just a few months before there, on June the 23rd of that same summer. Dr. King actually was here in Michigan, and he marched in the city of Detroit with 125,000 people. That was the Detroit Walk to Freedom, which culminated in a speech in which Dr. King laid the groundwork for that more famous speech at the March on Washington. With this march, Dr. King was targeting not just segregation and Jim Crow in the South, but racial discrimination in the North as well. The Detroit Walk to Freedom is further emblematic of the fact that while we might forget that in the shadow of the moments like the speech at Lincoln Memorial, Dr. King's legacy is one of tirelessness in the face of challenge. He fought justice not only on August 28th, on June 23rd, but every day before, between, and thereafter. So to honor Dr. King's legacy, we must do more than just understand, but we have to put into practice that same tirelessness in our own lives. This task is frankly more urgent, or at least it feels more urgent than it has in a while this year. A long-standing right that has become the bedrock of our democracy, every person's right to vote, is under attack. Across the country, state legislatures are moving to restrict access to the freedom to vote. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, reports that at least 19 states have passed laws restricting access to the ballot box in 2021. And furthermore, legislators have proposed bills to restrict access in 49 states, including the state of Michigan. These laws do a whole host of things. Some get rid of absentee ballot boxes altogether. They consolidate polling places, which force people to travel farther and stand in lines for longer time to vote. They outlaw giving food or water to people in certain places, in polling places, making it more difficult for people to stay in line for a long time. They make it harder to register to vote, more difficult and complicated to vote by mail. And this assault on voting rights and voters is already spilling over into 2022, as we've had many state legislatures already pre-file dangerous legislation for this year. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. and the others who marched alongside him stood tall for full participation for everyone in our democracy. Through their activism, through their action, and through their sacrifice, we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the ideal that every person should be able to vote. King said that the ultimate measure of a person is not whether they stand in moments of comfort and convenience, but where they stand in times of challenge and controversy. Now is our generation's time of challenge and controversy. It is time for us to stand up and stand tall and defend and extend voting rights to everyone. So to do so, we must understand that voting is truly a community exercise. We must understand that when we vote, we're making our voices heard as a member of our community. We shouldn't just participate ourselves. We have to bring others into the discussion and into the opportunity. So the more people we can bring into any conversation, the harder it will be for a minority of voices, no matter how loud or disruptive they may be, to drown others out. So I want to encourage you to go out and bring somebody into the process. Register people to vote. We all know somebody who didn't vote at their last opportunity. Talk to your families, your friends, your neighbors, grandparents about registering to vote and the importance of voting in this moment. Stay informed about the issues that affect all of us. And when election day comes, ask those in your life, if they have a plan to vote, and do what you can to help them make it to the polling place. So our goal, like those who marched and picketed and registered votes in the 60s, must be full participation in the democratic process. Because full participation creates full participation in the opportunities and benefits that our state and our nation have to offer. It builds strong communities. It creates strong places where citizens trust their leadership and know that their government is working for them on issues that matter, and gives them the power and the voice to hold those leaders accountable. It helps us overcome the challenges of racial inequities and discrimination that we face today, and in doing so, honor the legacy by getting us closer to the dream that Dr. King articulated, not just for himself, but for all of us. Full participation is more than a goal. In fact, I would call it a responsibility that we must never stop striving toward or to uphold. This responsibility has been passed down to us by so many who sacrificed on the days leading up to today. It's an obligation that we fulfill their service and hold each other in our country to be its best. Martin Luther King Jr. Day is when we remind ourselves of that responsibility, of our commitment to service, not passivity, and action, not complacency. I know that young people have always been and are right now up to this challenge. Like Dr. King, I have infinite hope that together, joined in partnership, we will overcome these challenges. That, like he said, unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. That right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil triumphant. I want to thank you once again for having me here, and I want to wish everyone a safe, happy, and healthy Martin Luther King Day. And please take this challenge and go and challenge someone else. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Todd, Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist. With that, I would like to turn it over to Gerard Wheeler from the University of Michigan-Dearborn, who will introduce our speakers and moderate the dialogue. Gerard?
Thank you, David, and everyone's spoken before me. Happy King Day, everyone. My name is Gerard, pronouns he and him, and I'm going to introduce our panel. So first we have Karis Hawkins. Karis is currently a sophomore at the University of Michigan-Dearborn. She's studying public health. She's currently the president of Black Student Union and also participates in Public Health Society and the Biology Club as members. She's super passionate about understanding and confronting healthcare disparities and racial bias in the healthcare system. Karis is a research assistant, a research assistant in the biochemistry department at Michigan Medicine, researching treatments for different genetic mutations. Next, we have Kaputaksha Das, or Das for short. Das is a doctoral student in computer information sciences at UM-Dearborn. Currently, Das is the president of Pride, the primary LGBTQ+ student org on campus, and is also the first international student to serve on the e-board as well. Their working goals involve them in making tech safer and fairer for everyone who is affected by it, and helping LGBTQ+ students find a place on campus, especially during the coronavirus pandemic. Next, we have Frankie Macintosh. Frankie is a senior at the University of Michigan-Flint, majoring in sociology and criminal justice with a minor in computer science. Frankie is a programming intern at the Intercultural Center, a poet, and has been a student leader throughout her time at UM-Flint, including serving in leadership positions on Block Club and other organizations. And then finally, our invited guest, Dr. Stokes. Dr. Stokes is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Michigan-Ann Arbor Center for Institutional Diversity. You may recognize Dr. Stokes from a viral video he did about 8 years ago, calling attention to the lack of Black male students and Black male experience at UCLA. Unfortunately, due to time, we won't be able to show the video, but I think you guys should really check it out. It's pretty amazing. Dr. Sai is a postdoctoral research fellow, and I think we're going to drop the link for the video into the chat or share it with you guys so you can check it out at your own when you have opportunity. But anyway, back to Dr. Sai. Dr. Sai is a postdoctoral research fellow for the National Center for Institutional Diversity at the University of Michigan. His research and activist work is focused on campus racial climate, racial equity, and student activism. He graduated from the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, with a BA in African American Studies. He earned his master's degree in higher education at the University of Pennsylvania and completed his PhD in urban education policy at the University of Southern California, USC. So now Dr. Stokes will kind of open us up with some remarks.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I hope everybody could see the PowerPoints. If not, please let me know in the chat and we'll get that fixed.
We can see it.
All right, perfect. All right, well, good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for joining me on this glorious day to remember one of the most revolutionary civil rights icons in history, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I want to especially thank the staff and student organizers of this event. Dr. David Luke actually reached out to me months ago about serving as a keynote, and along with student leaders, had the amazing idea to incorporate students into this discussion that will take place in about a half hour or so at the conclusion of this address. But once again, my name is Dr. Sai Stokes. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow for the National Center for Institutional Diversity at the University of Michigan-Ann Arbor. I also serve as a lecturer for the School of Education, where I teach a course titled Race, Racism, and Anti-Blackness in Higher Education. And in the first week of class that we had last week, I actually used a lot of Dr. King's work to help students learn about the history of racial formation in the United States and how it affects our education system today. So to speak with all of you today, to honor his legacy that has altered our universe beyond measure is an incredible opportunity that I am eternally grateful for. But to begin, I want to give an overview of what I'll be covering. For the first part of this keynote, I'll focus on the commodification of Dr. King's legacy and how his name has been invoked in ways that would disappoint no one more than the man himself. Second, and in relation to the discussion I'll have with student leaders later on, I will focus on the importance of student activists throughout the civil rights movement who actually criticized Dr. King in his early years for not being radical enough. And in the process, it made him a better activist and leader for the movement. So now to begin this first half, I want to draw attention to Dr. King's words, his own words. When Dr. King's name is invoked, people often turn to his I Have a Dream speech delivered on August 28th, 1963 on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And during this momentous occasion, Dr. King envisioned a world where his 4 children could one day live in a nation where they would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. But need I remind you that this was a dream, and a dream that has still remained unfulfilled long after his passing. A dream he knew would be difficult to fulfill because, as he states in his 1968 book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? He says, Negroes only hold one key to the double lock of peaceful change. The other is in the hands of the white community. See, he devoted much of his time criticizing who he referred to as the white moderate, In his letter from Birmingham jail, he states, "I must confess that over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal that you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. He knew no such season existed, as he emphasized that there is only one thing certain about time, and that is it waits for no one. If it is not used constructively, it passes you by." Now, the reason why I use these direct quotes and why I will continue using these quotes throughout this keynote address is to demonstrate that these words are not merely my interpretation, not merely a matter of opinion, not something that can be reduced as a passionate plea with a personal agenda, but rather that Dr. King's own words that have been, intentionally forgotten and replaced by inaccurate translations of his dream. These are his words. So to the people who invoke his name, but have no intentions of carrying on his radical vision, I have a message for you. To the political moderates, regardless of race, who condemn the rioters destroying property after they watched another one of us murdered by police, the political moderates who use Dr. King's nonviolent strategy as an excuse to criticize the justifiable rage we feel. I remind you that although King never agreed that violence was the answer, he was equally critical of the people who criticized violent methods but did nothing to advance the movement themselves. So he reminds us that it cannot be taken for granted that Negroes will adhere to nonviolence under any and all conditions. Violence has already been practiced too often, and always because remedies were postponed. Yet the average white person always has a responsibility. He has to resist the impulse to seize upon the rioter as the exclusive villain. He has to rise up with indignation against his own municipal, state, and national governments to demand that the necessary reforms be instituted, which alone will protect him. If he reserves his resentment only for the Negro, he will be the victim by allowing those who have the greatest culpability to evade responsibility. Now, we are 1.5 years from the summer of 2020, what many have referred to as a second freedom summer, which was led by the Movement for Black Lives, who forced this nation to reckon with the abuse that Black and brown people endure by the hands of law enforcement, specifically Black people. And we are also 1 year from January 6th, when white supremacists scaled the walls of the US Capitol and were met with far less force than the Black and brown nonviolent protesters who marched in cities across the nation just a few months prior. Yet even to this day, Black and brown activists are painted as irrational, immoral, and violent beings who must be policed. So to the political moderates, if you discount the Black Lives Matter movement entirely solely because you disagree with the actions of a few, you never cared about the movement to begin with. To the members of the school boards across the country who are waging an imaginary war against critical race theory, a framework that has never seen the light of day in a K-12 classroom. The school board members who invoke Dr. King's name to hide behind a Black face like contemporary blackface, who use his line not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character to argue against teaching Black history to our children. I remind you that Dr. King wanted nothing more than for his children in America to be taught the accurate history of this nation that was built by our enslaved African ancestors. Within the first few paragraphs of his 1963 book, Why We Can't Wait, Dr. King tells a story. He says, not all history was recorded in the books supplied to school children in Harlem or Birmingham, yet this boy and this girl know something of the part of history which has been censored by the white writers and purchasers of border education books. He goes on to describe how Black girls and boys in Harlem and Birmingham did not learn about racism from their history books, but because they, at such a young age, had already experienced the perilous force of racism that was obstructing their path toward freedom. He highlights how our history books have only served to intensify the Negro's sense of worthlessness and to augment the antagonistic doctrine of white supremacy. To make matters worse, and in relation to something that I fought for as a student activist a decade ago, and what my father fought for in the 60s while he was a student at Howard University, Colleges and universities, who were often the last line of defense in providing students with access to ethnic studies curriculum, refused to establish African-American studies, Asian American studies, and Latinx studies departments, leaving students with deplorable levels of racial literacy that they ultimately bring into their professional careers as our future doctors, lawyers, and politicians. In the same vein, to the members of the leadership at colleges and universities who hire a token person of color to performatively portray a commitment to diversity, but do nothing to provide resources and support to ensure their success, I remind you of Dr. King's quote. This is why many liberals have fallen into the trap of seeing integration in merely aesthetic terms, where a token number of Negroes adds color to a white-dominated power structure. They say our university has no problem with integration. We have one Negro faculty member and even one Negro chairman of a department. But King knew that one drop of color in a sea of whiteness was nothing to celebrate. To the white supremacists who cry cancel culture, despite being invited to speak at hundreds of college campuses across the nation, I remind you that both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. were denied from speaking at many universities because of their political views. An ironic twist to our contemporary circumstances where higher education administrators welcome white supremacists to college campuses so students can see both sides of the political spectrum. To the politicians who release statements and organize events to honor Dr. King, but do nothing to help advance racial justice beyond performative gestures, I remind you that he criticized politicians during the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1963. He says, with the dawn of 1963, plans were afoot all over the land to celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation, the 100th birthday of Negroes' liberation from bondage. In Washington, a federal commission had been established to mark the event. Governors of states and mayors of cities had utilized the date to enhance their political image by naming commissions, receiving committees, issuing statements, planning state pageants, sponsoring dinners, endorsing social activities, but alas, all the talk and publicity accompanying the centennial only served to remind a Negro that he still wasn't free, that he still lived a form of slavery disguised by certain niceties and complexity. See, Dr. King saw right through the performativity and demanded proactivity. He would be ashamed of the Republicans and Democrats on the Hill today who are blocking the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act from passing, a bill named after someone he once mentored. I cannot imagine how he would feel if he knew that nearly 60 years later, we are still fighting for the same rights he was fighting for in 1965. So to the politicians who cry communism and socialism when people demand universal health care, housing for all, and adequate wages, I remind you that King was above all an anti-capitalist and more aligned with what would be considered a socialist agenda in today's day and age. He recognized that there is no deficit in human resources. The deficit is in human will. He understood that any economic agenda committed to racial justice will only be successful if it involves billions of dollars dedicated specifically to Black people, who have been expected to win a race where white people were given a 300-year head start. He demanded that we needed the equivalent of a Medicare for housing. He demanded a guaranteed living wage for all citizens. He even called on President John F. Kennedy to pass a second Emancipation Proclamation. But most importantly, he demanded that this be accomplished through the lens of equity rather than equality. He says, it is, however, important to understand that giving a man his due may often mean giving him special treatment. I'm aware of the fact that this has been a troublesome concept for many liberals, since it conflicts with their traditional ideal of equal opportunity and equal treatment of people according to their individual merits. But this is a day which demands new thinking and a reevaluation of old concepts. A society that has done something special against the Negro for hundreds of years, but now must do something special for him in order to equip him to compete on a just and equal basis. He exposed the American dream to be a myth of meritocracy. Contrary to uneducated claims that he advocated for color blindness in his I Have a Dream speech, he actually stressed the importance of making race salient in every facet of life. He knew that if you claim not to see color, there's no way for you to ever see justice. But instead, Dr. King was subjected to illegal FBI wiretaps, was the victim of a political defamation campaign that was carried out by the likes of US presidents, federal agents, and the press, was labeled a communist when he fought for basic rights, and was the victim of assassination attempts to him and his family by white supremacist vigilantes. And J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, created an entire portfolio targeting Dr. King. Through those illegal wiretaps, he acquired evidence of King's extramarital affairs, going so far as to send an anonymous package to his home that threatened to reveal the findings to the world, and he actually urged Dr. King to commit suicide rather than risk public shame and damage the movement. So no politician, no federal agency, no corporation should ever invoke the name and legacy of a man who opposed everything they stood for. And with that message, I transition to the end of this keynote, which is dedicated to student activists. See, after Dr. King was released after 8 days in Birmingham jail in 1963, he can no longer ignore the young people on college and university campuses that have become the driving force of the movement. He actually wrote that I had decided to put into operation a new phase of our campaign, which I felt would speed victory. I called my staff together and repeated a conviction that I had been voicing ever since the campaign began. If our drive was to be successful, we must involve the students of our community. In most of the recent direct action crusades, it had been the young people who sparked the movement. He knew the power of the student voice and understood that the movement would not succeed without them. The primary reason he was even in jail was because many student activists in the late 50s and early 60s, most notably Lonnie King and Kwame Ture, who at the time went by Stokely Carmichael, they criticized Dr. King in the early stages of the movement for making these grandiose speeches without actually putting his own body on the line like many of the students across the nation were already doing. He knew they were right, but was often stuck in the balance between trying to maintain the movement's appeal to the white masses and serving as a voice for the most disenfranchised Black people in the country. But student activists were also frustrated with the fact that all of their efforts were being credited to Dr. King by national media, despite the fact that he often had nothing to do with their successful demonstrations. They were also frustrated that they were fighting over the same sources of funding, most of which were awarded to Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, rather than the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, also known as SNCC. However, despite the justifiable criticism he received from student activists, particularly those who align with the ideologies of the Black Power movement, his perspective allowed him to recognize that it was the people who moved their leaders, not the leaders who moved the people. And as a leader himself, he knew student activists motivated him to be better, and he eventually treated them as equals. Dr. King shared a story in one of his books about a talk he gave in Chicago where young activists from the Black Power movement were the only audience to ever boo him on stage. He wrote, "In all the speaking I've done in the United States before varied audiences, including some hostile whites, the only time I have ever been booed was one night in Chicago in a mass meeting by some young members of the Black Power movement. But as I lay awake thinking, I finally came to myself, and I cannot for the life of me have less than patience and understanding for those young people. For 12 years, I and others like me had held out radiant promises of progress. I had preached to them about my dream, and they were now booing because they felt that we were unable to deliver on our promises. They were booing because we had urged them to have faith in people who had too often proved to be unfaithful. They were now hostile because they were watching the dream that they had so readily accepted turn into a frustrating nightmare." And he started to sound more like Malcolm X toward the end of his life because of that. When we look back on this era in history, we forget that it was the student activists who held one of the greatest civil rights icons accountable for upholding the promises he made. They did not fear him. They did not blindly follow him with unwavering loyalty. They saw him as a leader who was not immune to critique. They did not ignore his imperfections because they knew that Dr. King, and all Black people for that matter, had the potential for greatness. But nonetheless, Dr. King was a man of many flaws, too many of which were used to discredit the entire movement, but some of which were valid and could be used as lessons for how we can strengthen our movement today. And one of his most notable flaws was his reluctance to promote Black women into leadership roles. Coming from the patriarchal structure of the Black church in the 60s, he never truly embraced Black women like Ella Baker, who founded SNCC and later worked for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or Fannie Lou Hamer, who also helped lead SNCC and along with Ella Baker formed the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or MFDP. And this flaw of Dr. King's would ultimately serve as a detriment to the broader civil rights movement, regardless of how successful it became. But today, the movement for Black Lives, which you created by 3 Black women, 2 of whom identify as queer, has firmly established an intersectional political agenda that includes trans, queer, gender nonconforming, intersex, and differently abled Black people. Hashtag Black Lives Matter has inspired student activists across the nation to emulate the same inclusive model within their own campus organizations, a level of progress that many people from Dr. King's era never reached. So as we continue to create history in our current civil rights era, we must remember the urgency of now while also carrying enough patience and perspective to pursue a dream that may never become a reality in our lifetime. We must remain hopeful, but promise that our hope will not lead us back into complacency. We must illuminate the beauty of the struggle itself rather than allow pessimism to cast a shadow over our journey toward liberation. And most of all, we must remember who we are, a generation that is fortunate enough to have the wings of Dr. King's legacy carry us into new horizons. And with that, I said, thank you so much. And I can't wait to speak with these student activists that we have here today.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Sai. I'm really glad that we got you here to share some of those messages. If I could have all the student panelists join me now, you guys can turn your cameras on. That would be awesome. Hello, friends. Everyone looks great. Hi. So welcome, guys. And I think we can kick the conversation off by you guys just sort of candidly responding to Dr. Sai's keynote. We can start with whomever. Or I can call on someone, like we in class.
I can start. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Stokes, for your remarks. Listening to all of your remarks on Dr. King and his legacy, I think that everything you said, especially about student activism, is so important in this time, in this country. I think we're at a pivotal point where we need to see real, long-lasting changes happening. And I think right now we have a lot of young people, especially college students, getting out there and sharing their voice. And especially in 2020, where we saw a lot of people, young people, protesting when we saw the murder of George Floyd. And we saw a lot of young people getting out to vote and registering to vote. A lot of those changes start with voting. And I think that's something that is up for debate right now, unfortunately, in the government. And student voices play a big role in, getting messages out there and bringing attention to issues that are very important to the community. Dr. King's legacy still remains important today. One of the quotes that you brought up, there's no deficit in human resources, the deficit is in human will. I think that is one of the most true quotes that I've heard today. Sorry. That is the real truth of, unfortunately, the climate in the United States currently. We have the ability to change things. It just is up to the people to make those changes happen. And it's up to us and everybody else to be able to get out there and share our voices, regardless of anything that maybe Nay said about you or Nay said about the movement that you're fighting for. It's important that you just get out there and share your voice, because your voice is the most important voice. The things that are put into place in the world, put into place in our country, affect you first. The people who are in positions of power are, unfortunately, in some cases, unwilling to lose that power. And it's important that we recognize and understand that we have to sometimes be part of uncomfortable situations and put people in uncomfortable conversations in order to incite real change. So I really appreciate all your remarks that you said and that you spoke about. And I think just remembering the importance of student activism is the biggest part of remembering Dr. King's legacy, because students and young people right now have so many avenues to promote activism and promote change. We just have to remember the power of our voice.
Thank you, Karis. Spot on. Frankie, Das, do you guys want to chime in?
So yeah, I can go. That was a very brilliant keynote. Thank you for that, Dr. Stokes. And I feel it's very important to mention like the constant struggle of student activism as we now enter like an age where more and more people are more aware of the fact that students and young people are fighting for things they believe in, are fighting for justice. It's also like a struggle to prevent a sort of like acceptance of that's how the norm is without actually bringing out change. There's always a thing with universities or any form of power where there's a sort of convenience in having dialogue without having to deal with the discomfort of actual action from it. So what ends up happening is people will say a lot of things. There'll be a lot of things online. You'll have social media back and forward. There's a lot of this noise, but at the end of the day, we're not actually cutting through what the problem is. We just accept that, yeah, we're just noisy. Activism is noisy. Activism is this and that. It's good to have, if universities have young students who are doing good or trying to do good, yeah, it's good for the university. It's something they can sell. Oh, we're diverse. Oh, we have quote unquote uncomfortable situations, but there's no real change happening. The same statistics still apply year after year after year. And that's like the thing that we have to face moving forward, like to keep making activism adapt to the fact that we need change, not just acknowledgement of change, not just fighting for, hey, there is something wrong. Yes, okay, we know that's wrong, but how do we change that? How do we listen to the people who've been trying to tell us that we have problems or trying to adjust like new situations? And I feel like that's very important to take away, that like, how do we keep ensuring that dialogue results in action, both through civil disobedience, through acts of violence, or whatever? Like, protest is a symptom. You can't stop protests by just stopping protests. That's a symptom. You'll never fix the cause. So the action to fix cause, I think, is very important.
Thank you, Das. Frankie, would you like to chime in at all?
Yes, and I'm glad that Das, if I said it right, touched on how protest is a symptom, and also it must lead into action, because human emotion is very, very powerful, and it, particularly when it comes down to having this system impacting people of color for so long. It arises a lot of emotion in people. So, and I really liked when Dr. Stokes touched on rage and how summer of 2020, when people were critiquing the rioters, and critiquing rioters with nonviolence and trying to use MLK to just make sure that we basically use peaceful, nonviolent activities because of this. But actually, the whole more of the point is violence needed to be shown inside this particular movement, because by Michael Max always says, by any means necessary. And it comes to a point now that when we are used to waiting and waiting, it's almost like a boiling point. And like I said, protests can be a symptom. So, and I think that the keynote was very important to touch on. So, you guys pretty much touched on everything that I was getting ready to say. So
Thank you, Frankie. Dr. Sai, I want to invite you to respond to the students. But before that, so Frankie, I hear what you're saying, and I do not disagree, but I'm thinking about another quote for MLK that says that hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And so I just offer that as sort of, to counter, not calling for violence, but by any means necessary, sort of like, what's the line? Like, how do we toe that line? But before Dr. Sai, I want to give you a moment to respond, so.
Yeah, there's actually an amazing book by Dr. Joseph here, The Sword and the Shield. This is incredible work, but basically it tracks the history of MLK and Malcolm X, and how towards the end of the career, they actually started to collide in a lot of their ideologies and where they stood. And when when Malcolm X came back from his travels, he actually was interviewed about King. And they said, well, you know, people were trying to pin them as these drastic opposites that, you know, didn't have the same distal goal, that were going about it in drastically different ways. But even Malcolm X knew, if the threat of me means you're going to listen to Dr. King, then I'll take it. And by him saying that to a national media outlet, I think really showed the solidarity within the movement towards the end of it, towards the end of their lives, unfortunately. But by the end, they actually started to converge, and they only met, I believe, one time in person. And so the fact that they were kind of within these polar opposite worlds, the narrative was really dictated by, you know, the lack of communication. They didn't have text messages. Malcolm X couldn't hit up MLK, you know, just like boom, boom, like what's up. But, you know, a lot of the narrative was by the national media trying to pin them against each other to divide and conquer this movement and try to destroy it. And so I think by them showing solidarity amongst each other, it actually showed their similarities, and the fact that they had the same distal goal. Their objectives of how to get there were a lot different. But Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr. wouldn't be who he was without Malcolm X being that diametrical force to force people to listen to Dr. King, who they saw as the more rational one, which ended up allowing us to get to the point where the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed and the Voting Rights of 1965 was passed. So without each other, they wouldn't have been successful. So I think rather than seeing them as diametric opposites, we have to see them as almost the same person, you know, so.
Awesome, thank you. So I'm going to move us along. Our next question is, how have we seen commodification of other student movements or other movements in general? And I think one that comes to my mind immediately is sort of just branding for pride, how that's just sort of this new thing. But I'll let you guys chime in about commodification of other movements.
I'm gonna let the students go ahead on this one. I'm gonna take a step back.
I'll go first. I'll just talk about that because I have a lot of things to say about that. I'll keep it short, but I'm the president of Pride at UM-Dearborn, and which is why this is a topic that means a lot to me, about the commodification of not who we are as people, but what we are as identities, and how that can be packaged in very nicely and shown to people. And that is a very difficult struggle, because at one hand, the commodification helps us because it helps our numbers, it helps gets people in, because all of a sudden we're more accessible, we're more open. But at the same time, it's also taking away from what it means to be Pride, what it means to be discriminated against, to have the LGBTQ people be hunted and killed and just be put in these worst places all throughout history, just continuously pushed to the side. So there's this constant struggle of, yes, we're getting more popular, like websites like TikTok have made it even more easier for people to be seen, but is what that's being seen really what we are? Are we we're still not able to make any progress? We still struggle on getting things done. We still struggle on getting ways to protect our own students on campus, to get rights passed, to get protections, to get resources. Like we have this showmanship that, oh, we're thriving, but we're not. We're just trying to survive and trying to look happy while doing it. And that's the nasty commodification of it, it's normalization. We're normalizing the fact that the constant uphill struggle is normal. It's not that, yeah, we all know that we're going to reach a final goal of equality or equity or diversity, but the notion that we have to continuously fight for it, we have to defend ourselves, we have to justify it, we have to have an us versus them narrative no matter what. That is like that's the commodification. You're selling a story. You're telling a story of a struggle, but you're not solving the struggle. You're not addressing the problems. You're not getting to the resources. And that's what I feel is very difficult about the whole problem of commodifying student activism. It's good to look at, but no one wants to solve it.
Thank you, Das. And I hear you. It's like you see us, but do you really care? You know, I just think about like the larger companies that sort of do it to kind of boost their numbers, to say like, oh, like we support LGBT people. So shop here, you know, Adidas with like rainbow, whatever. I just think about how rainbow has become commodified. Then I also think about Juneteenth. And like everyone's like, before 2020, no, like most people did not know about Juneteenth at all. And then last year, it's become a federal holiday, which absolutely sure, like let's recognize it. But what are we really doing about it? And I just found it interesting how many people ask me about like barbecue, like how are you celebrating Juneteenth? I'm like, how I always do, like living my life, you know. Sorry, I'll let you guys talk.
Yes, I agree completely with what you were saying, Das. I was just thinking when I heard that of how during the Black Lives Matter movement, especially in 2020, like Jar was saying with Juneteenth is one example of that, but also all these businesses and celebrities and just people and big businesses coming out and saying, we're supporting anti-racism, we're going to reform our practices and change this and change that and do all that. And we stand with the Black community. And all those messages that we saw coming out during that summer and since then haven't heard anything else from those same companies. A lot of that reform hasn't happened. A lot of the things that they probably said that they were going to do for their employees or for the Black community in general hasn't happened, because it's easy to say one thing just when the movement is happening and it's out there and you can't not say anything. But then when it comes down and the rubber hits the road and you actually have to do something, that's when people get quiet and people don't want to say anything and they don't want to talk about and have those hard conversations. So it's really difficult to see in 2020 when you're like seeing this pivotal point in history and seeing so many people out and protesting and exercising their rights. And then you see all these businesses saying, we support this, we're supporting anti-racism, we're supporting the Black community, but they don't put anything back into the Black community. They kind of use it as a commodification. And they use it to bring people to their brands and to say, oh, they're supporting the Black community, so we should buy from them. They kind of use it at that time. And then from there, they don't do anything to change anything. And it's pretty unfortunate that that's what they bring the attention to, but they're not bringing attention to what exactly can you do as a person who might buy from this brand to change the structure of our government in the United States, to make meaningful changes that will actually benefit the Black community. You don't really see businesses posting out about voting rights, or you don't really see businesses posting about actual things that people can vote for, that you don't really see them posting about getting more access to voting or health inequities. You don't really see any of that on the side of where things can actually be changed and how you can actually change things. You mostly see that performative activism where you really see people posting and saying something and not really doing anything about it because they don't want to talk about the harder side of those movements, the side where people are actually living this struggle on the day to day. And you don't really see them talking about that. You kind of just see it on TV or on social media, or what some big business CEO comes out and says as a statement at the time. But beyond that, you don't really see much action, which is an unfortunate reality of this country and of the big businesses that this country is kind of funded by and run by. Those big brands you see, Nike, especially, I remember with Colin Kaepernick, did that whole ad run with him with the Just Do It, and after he was fired from the San Francisco 49ers, and they did that whole ad campaign with him. But since then, what has Nike really done to give back to the Black community is the question. Has Nike really put efforts into making voting more accessible? Has Nike put efforts into helping the Black community and helping people and changing policies and helping the community? Because community is what's important at the end of the day. And it's unfortunate that we see these big ad campaigns for a couple of months and they run it and bunches of people go out to support that, but you don't really see the same support reflected back in the community.
Sorry, my bad, real quick. It was actually just a couple days ago when Dr. King's own kids came out with a statement. I'm sure a lot of people saw it, saying we don't want today to be celebrated until the Freedom to Vote Act was passed. So the fact that we shouldn't even be calling this, a celebration of any sorts, if they don't want us to be calling it, this is more of an intervention, right? We're calling out these corporations, these companies, politicians, these university leaders for having these events, but maybe they don't, actually enact progress or change in their own either micro level or macro level ways to any extent. So that's a great point. And you're agreeing with what Dr. King's own kids just said, a couple days ago. So definitely, absolutely.
Thank you. I was gonna say you don't have to mute yourself. You could have kept going. Frankie, I'll give you a moment to chime in. But Karis, it makes me think of this whole diversity, equity, inclusion, sometimes justice, depending on the group conversation, and how we're quick to capitalize underlying the D of diversity. Like we'll bring in a bunch of people, and the I, like sure, we'll hear what you have to say, but when it comes to the equity piece, the piece about switching power, about exchanging, about balance, that's where we get like, ooh, something in my throat, can't answer your question right now. And so it just kind of makes me think about that conversation. And it's like, how do we elevate the equity piece? Please, Frankie, if you want to chime in.
I just wrote down a couple. For me, like I had to like really write something in order to just get into. Yes. So I wrote down just like commodity is just used for comfortability. I think those words that came up to me is that activism is usually something that is bought and sold into capitalism. And as we've seen that with the big companies and corporations saying Black Lives Matter and come and sending all of these words, sending all of these statements. But I realized words only go so far. We can say that we stand with you, but we don't have any policies in place to hire more, to hire or promote Black and brown people or people of color or any identity of sorts. So it's just that it's only words just go so far. And I think that with Dr. King's family is just saying that the Freedom Act, Voting Act should be passed. And I really, really stand with that of just saying like, how can we celebrate this day knowing that we still have this policy that needs to be passed, this bill that needs to be passed. So that's my thoughts.
Thank you, Frankie. Dr. Sy, anyone else want to chime back in? Good. Okay, I'll move on. So I'm going to kind of deviate just a little bit from the questions and ask a question that came up for me during Dr. Sy's keynote. When you were talking about when Dr. King mentioned that the white moderate liberal, or maybe he didn't say liberal, he said white moderate. He said that might be his worst enemy. And so my question is more so around like allyship. And like, what does that mean? What does that look like? How do we build coalitions? Because we can't do this work alone. And this is something that I've been personally struggling with. And so I want some advice from you guys. But it's how do we build intersectional, intergenerational, multicultural movements? Like, because we all are humans and we all occupy this earth, like it's the only place where we can live. And so we have to kind of like learn to live together, even though we might all have differences. But we need each other essentially at the end of the day. And so yeah, it's just a question, like how do we bring in people who may annoy us? Let's just be honest. They might annoy us and get on our nerves, but at the end of the day, we do need them to move things forward. And they generally do care. So I'll just open that up. I think you guys kind of know where I'm going with it. Anyone feel free to chime in. Hoping I didn't throw you guys off too much.
No, I think allyship, like you said, that's a hard, kind of a hard pill to swallow a little bit at the beginning. I think of being part of movements and part of social change and promoting equity. It's hard to also at the same time, kind of feel like you have to educate others on why these issues are important. And it's unfortunate that that kind of gets placed on you as maybe a face of, say, a club or a face of a movement. It kind of gets placed on you to educate everybody else as to why they should care. I think that's the key part of allyship, is not having to educate others as to why they should care, but they need to go out and do the research for themselves. And they need to learn why this is important to people, what they can do to change things, how much power and what power they have as an ally that somebody else who is a person of color or somebody who is LGBTQ plus might not have that same level of, influence in certain conversations. I think it's important to recognize the power you have. And also, I think allyship is difficult because a lot of people will do performative activism and say they're an ally. So claiming to be an ally can't just be performative activism at the same time, because performative activism is very easy. Allyship is hard. Being an ally is putting yourself in uncomfortable situations and having hard conversations with people. You can't just post a black square on social media and say you're an ally, or you can't just say I support the Black Lives Matter movement, but at the same time do nothing else beyond that. I think it's taking that one step further from the performative activism can kind of put you in that direction of allyship. Putting action into place. Action, I think, is the key part of allyship. You can't just say something or be a partner or be a support to someone and do nothing at the same time. You have to actually do something, and you have to help promote change, and you have to be out there on the same streets as other people are, fighting for the same things that people are fighting for. And it's hard to be a part of a movement, and also seeing so many people just take that as a way to be seen as an ally, but not actually be an ally. And finding the people who actually want to be allies to the movement, it's difficult, but I think that in this time that we're at now, especially within my generation, a lot of people want to learn and they want to know what they can do. It's just a means of them understanding that we can't be the people who tell them what they need to do all the time. They have to know what they need to do and what they can do on their own. And I think that's the key part of what needs to change with allyship, is people need to be able to learn for themselves and also not depend on the people who are the faces of those movements to just teach them everything and tell them what they can do step by step. They have to take it that step further and do the action on themselves. And that's what changes the conversation.
And they can look at their history to see how people similar to them have supported abolition movements and similar movements in the past. I think that's also super key and a helpful way for people who aren't necessarily tied to a certain struggle to become like an effective ally and not depend on people. Look at others like you who've supported similar movements and what have they done. So yes, thank you so much for that, Karis. Anyone else like to chime in? And I do want to ask one more question. We have about 7 more minutes. There's one more question I want to ask. So don't rush, but
Yeah, I'll just go real quick. I was trying to find it in a couple of the books I have here in front of me. I couldn't find the exact quote, but basically what Dr. King was saying was, it's not like we're eliminating all white people from this movement. We need white people for this movement. We need co-conspirators. We need people who are going to be on the front lines, who will literally put their body on the lines as well. I know during a lot of protests last year, or well, in 2020, even when I was out there, anytime we marched somewhere and the cops showed up, there's no property damage, no nothing happening. But as soon as they stop us in our tracks, we send all the white people to the front, because we know that they're going to treat their bodies a lot differently than ours, and that they're going to be respected in certain ways. And that's unfortunate, but kind of utilizing that privilege to our advantage as a coalition, as a collective movement, as we march forward towards progress. So it's not necessarily eliminating all white people from the movement, but reassigning their duties and responsibilities to take back what they think is, they should have a leadership role. But no. Just take a step back, understand that you could be a part of this movement, but actually give the voice to the people where this actually affects the material and fatal consequences in fatal ways. So yeah, just being able to take a step back, understand what allyship actually means in that process, but not always thinking you have to be a leader in the movement, because there's plenty of us out there who can take that mantle. So.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sai. Frankie, Das, you guys like to chime in?
Those were like very good points, both by Karis and Dr. Stokes. And I feel that's very important. Like the idea of allyship, it's a very difficult thing to promote or get across, because what is very normalized for us, like we're allies out, not really out of choice, but circumstance, where we're forced to band together, we're forced to fight for what is just, for what is right. It's very difficult to tell someone else who's never experienced these things. What they have in privilege, we have from experience. They have the privilege of knowing something, and while the rest of us have the experience, and they're very two different things which don't really equate to each other. So it's very difficult for someone with privilege, and as someone from India with different privileges and having seen that, it's very important to be like, what I constitute as the knowledge of my privileges allowing me to be in a better place can never equate to the experience. And someone from the other side can never teach me that, because they've never had that privilege. They've only seen the privilege be used against them, never for them. So the fact that we have like to teach someone with the privilege on how to use it to be a better ally is one of the more difficult things, because you don't even know what it could do. You don't know how powerful privilege is in helping you be a better ally, because that's only something you can learn yourself, because you're the one who has it. So the ability to teach someone to use their privilege, I feel like, is a very important part of helping getting better allies. So when people come to us, come to Pride, or people want to know more, it's less about who we are, because people know who we are now. It's more about who they are and how they can help, how they can use their privilege and their powers and what is their experience of privilege to help us. And that is very important. That's how we can get dialogue forward and action done.
Thank you, Das.
I think also I really enjoyed that Das just touched on privilege and power and how people show up. I think that if we focus on allyship and how people show up, that is the most important piece when it comes down to allyship. And for me, like Rihanna said, pull up. You know, if anyone watched that video, Rihanna is talking about how, are you willing to put yourself on the line? You know, and I think that is something that comes with the terms and conditions of allyship. And people, when it comes to allyship, all of us play a role into it. And I think that we oftentimes, let's talk about the intersectionality of allyship, because I would consider myself an ally to someone else, and we all are considered to allies. So I think that it's very important to impact, and very important to remember, very important to recognize the intersectionality of allyship, and also recognize that storytelling is very, very important. It is the archives of the human experience. So it's very important to amplify our voices and amplify the voices around us when it comes down to allyship.
Amen. So good. So I don't see Dr. David's face yet. So I'm gonna ask this last question. So how do we feel that our own social identities impact the way our voice is heard? Yeah, that's the question. So how do we assume, like, how do our identities affect the way the movements we're involved in turn out? Anyone can go. And not to single you out, Das, but I was really hoping that you could add a little international perspective to this. That's why I really want to ask this question, because I feel like sometimes in the US, we're just only in the US, we don't think about the world outside. And so if you could, if all of you could chime in, Das, I really would like for you to bring in an international perspective if you can. Thank you.
Yeah, the idea of social identity is a very tricky question, because social identity is part of who you are, and it's something you should be proud of or take part of or utilize the privilege of it. But it's also something you don't get to dictate. It's just things that describe you, but not necessarily are some things that you would use for yourself, which puts it in a very interesting perspective where you might be considered special or different or the one opening the door for people or leading the ground. But it makes it very difficult to emphasize that you're not the only one with this identity. You're unique, but there are so many other people behind you who allow you to get to this point. It's like considering like it's never the one piece of sand that makes the pile. It's a whole bunch of collectives. It's a bunch of collectives. Identity is not ever for one person. It's for a group of people. So assigning one identity to a person and being like they're the voice online and whatever they say is gospel takes away from both the identity and what that person also probably wants. And that's very important to me because as a person who's an international student, who's also pursuing a doctorate, who's also in Pride, it's very difficult to juggle like what am I trying to present as who I am? Like am I trying to sell parts of my identity to make myself more appealable? Or am I just being myself? And in the process, am I fighting for the causes I believe in? Or am I fighting for causes that my identity dictates I should believe in? And that's a very difficult balancing act. And I don't know how to answer in a clean way, I guess. So I'm going to end it at that.
That was great. Thank you. Anyone else want to chime in before we have to close, unfortunately? You guys are great. I'm enjoying this. I was so nervous. Now I'm like, oh, this is fun.
I'll just, oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, I was just wanted to comment really quickly. I agree completely with what Das was saying. It's like they said, a difficult balancing act of figuring out what you kind of want to present to the outside world in terms of your social identity, because it's not something you choose, it's just something that's assigned to you. It's hard to, I think, in terms of your social identity, I guess, not necessarily choose what to fight for, but what you are showing the world, I guess, that you're not necessarily choosing is the most important thing, but I think your social identity has a lot to do with what movements and what social issues you are, I guess, kind of identified with. The world will kind of put those types of things on you to be the speaker for, say, Black Lives Matter because you're Black, but that's not the case because you're just one person with one experience in a whole movement. And the things that you find important within the Black Lives Matter movement and just within the Black experience might not be what the next person sitting next to you does. So it's not, I guess, it's difficult to be kind of put in this place where you're expected to just be like the one example of what the Black Lives Matter looks like for a Black student. When you're not, and that's not your expectation for yourself. I don't believe in any way that what I believe in is just a reflection of what all Black people believe in, because that's not the case. Because what everybody believes in, what everybody fights for, it's different, and their experiences are different. And so I think it's just hard with that social identity to kind of be expected to have the exact same beliefs and have the exact same changes that you want to fight for. And that's just like who you are, and you kind of get placed in this box, and that's just like what you are fighting for. When that's not necessarily the case, you kind of have to learn what the experiences of everybody within that community and within that identity are. And you can't just expect everybody to have that same perspective and to have those same experiences either. And so it's difficult to kind of speak for a group, and when you're in positions like you're the president of Pride like Das is, and when for me, when I'm the president of BSU, it's kind of difficult to speak for the group when your experience is not the experience of everybody within that group, but it is kind of on you to make sure that your voice is out there, and the voice of these groups of people, Black students, is out there. So it's kind of just both sides of it, where you are speaking for a group of people, and that's kind of, you're representing that group, but also understanding that just because you have this position, it isn't 100%. Your experience isn't just what it is. It's not a one thing. It's a lot of layers, and it's a lot of multifaceted parts of an experience, and understanding that you have to learn all parts of the experience, I think, is the key part of that. You can't just take one person's word for gospel. You have to hear everybody's story and hear everybody's experience and perspective. And that's the most important part of movements, is hearing everyone and not just hearing one person who might be the face or who's on the news right now. You have to hear everybody's story, because everybody's story is important.
Thank you. So Frankie, I'll give you like 1 minute or less if you want, because I have one more person that I want to invite to speak very briefly before we close out. So did you have a?
So the question was how our social identities, repeat the question right, because I wrote it down, but I want to make sure it's right.
Oh, how do your social identities impact the way your voice is heard? Okay,
so just to touch on, I'm just gonna say her last name. Hawkins was touched on about how our stories are important, but at the same time, we're all not monolithic. I'm not monolithic at all, and it's very important that the way that we show up and the way that we are impacted by experiences dealing with capitalism, racism, and all these other social issues, it's how are we being heard? And I think that's very important when we touch on situations like on campus as a particular Black student, and with particularly UM-Flint, how our students are being heard, especially with things that goes on with the African Studies program currently is on auditorium here on our campus. Is that a way of showing that our social identities are impacted? Is that a way that our campus is hearing our voice in some way, or telling our stories in a way? Just looking at how these systems play in the part of how can we showcase or impact our voice without being tone police. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you. And as with any good dialogue, it's really hard to find a place to cut it short, right? So I have to be the bad person here. But I do want to thank our invited guest, Dr. Stokes, our exceptional student panelists, skilled moderator, Gerard Wheeler. At this point, under non-pandemic circumstances, we would dispatch all the people in attendance to their volunteer sites at this time. Instead, I want to refer you to the numerous service opportunities available through the Office of Engaged Learning throughout the winter semester, from alternative spring break and summer breaks, MI breaks, to service Saturdays and numerous other service opportunities in the community. There are plenty of opportunities to plug in. So check out umflint.edu/engaged-learning-office for more details. Now I want to invite a local community member, Percy Glover, to talk briefly about some work he's involved with that connects directly to Dr. King's legacy and the power of our voices in the voting booths. Percy Glover is a criminal justice reform expert. In his work as a Genesee County ambassador, he has been instrumental in developing a jail voting model in the Genesee County Jail. Where jail voting didn't exist a few years ago, Percy has been one of the key people who has created a process in the Genesee County Jail where the population of residents were afforded the opportunity to voice themselves in the last 5 elections. Percy?
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Dr. David. I want to start off with a quote from Martin Luther King. Voting is the foundation stone for political action. A great deal of people do not recognize and understand that if you are residing in a county jail in Michigan, that you can still vote in any and every election. That vote can happen by vote by mail, or it can happen in person. The significance of this is every person who is of legal voting age should be afforded the opportunity to vote. We've created a process at the Genesee County Jail with the support of Genesee County Sheriff Chris Swanson, where for the last 5 straight elections, people have been provided the opportunity to cast their voices in the election. Again, it's important that we afford every person of eligible voting age to have the ability to vote. The unfortunate thing, you will have a great deal of people who will feel like people in jail should not have this opportunity. They shouldn't be afforded the chance. Not true. Every person, regardless of class, education, economics, race, should be given the opportunity. I want to say thank you again to the University of Michigan-Flint family for giving me the opportunity to share a few words on this, about the work we're doing. Jail voting here in the Genesee County Jail is one of the few places across the country where it's happening. Obviously, some states across the country, as a convicted person, you cannot vote, whether you're in the community, whether you reside in the jail, whether you reside in the prison. So we've been really blessed to stamp out a process and give every people an opportunity for the men and women residing in the Genesee County Jail to voice themselves regardless of their status. Again, if you reside in a jail in Michigan, if you haven't been convicted, if you haven't been sentenced, you can still vote in any and every election. And again, every person who is of eligible voting age should be afforded this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Glover. We are particularly grateful for you sharing this important voting rights work you're doing. We know, as the Lieutenant Governor mentioned, as Dr. Stokes mentioned, the King family has requested there be no celebration of MLK Day without passage of voting rights legislation. Voting rights was a cause that Dr. King was very passionate about, which is why many feel the Voting Rights Act was among the culminating achievements of the civil rights movement. Indeed, when we recognize the power of our voice, one place that power is evident is the voting booth. In order to maintain that power and that voice, the King family is urging us to advocate for continued voting rights legislation and the work that Mr. Glover and others are doing, as well as encouraging people to register to vote as our Lieutenant Governor recommended, connect directly to that cause. So please stay engaged with what's going on in local, state, and national politics regarding voting rights. And as this is more than a day, continue to engage in service within the Flint and Genesee County communities throughout the year by plugging into some of the offerings through the Office of Engaged Learning. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day. And